our work over the years has swung round increasingly to being concerned with non-native marine species. And one of the things we've been doing is surveying up into estuaries, as I'll explain in the talk, to see how far marine species penetrate up through into the estuary. So Chris Wood, who's on screen as well, has worked with me since 1997, I think, Chris, is that right? And so I've done the sort of voiceover for this, but this is very much joint work of the two of us. I should also apologise in advance for that. I've got to zip off after questions. I won't be around all evening, much as I'd like to be, so I'll have to catch up on the second talk in the recorded version. Okay, so Nigel, I think I'm going to need to have a fairly clear screen for the presentation, aren't I? I'll share the screen and see what happens.
Your screen will take over.
Yeah, okay. I do still have...
Hello, I'm going to be talking about non-native marine species in the Dart estuary. The majority of ports and harbours are in an estuarine setting, so a lot of our commerce passes through estuaries, and with commerce come non-native species. So estuaries generally have quite a lot of non-native species, generally more so than would be found on the open coast. However, systematic information on the distribution of non-native species along estuarine gradients isn't yet readily available. So an estuary will run from fresh water at the tidal limit down to the open sea, or something like the open sea at the mouth of the estuary. If we consider a sort of generalised estuary, so we're going from fresh water to something like fully saline seawater, and there's this strong salinity gradient therefore, but there'll be other changes in environmental conditions as well going along the estuary, things like sediment load, temperature and oxygen concentration. And we might imagine that species would be arrayed along the estuarine gradient according to their environmental tolerances. So we'd have some which were limited to the mouth of the estuary, others which favoured conditions further up the estuary, for instance. Now, if we are planning a development of some sort at a particular point in an estuary, then it would be useful to know what non-native species are likely to be present at that point in the estuary in terms of those which would threaten your commercial activities in as much as they are problematic non-native species, or those which might potentially be exported from your development, say in departing ships with stuff on their hulls or in ballast water. An alternative perspective is if you're considering the conservation of a particular point on an estuary, what non-native species are likely to come in there and potentially be a problem with your conservation activities. So if we have the information on the right, we can basically, with any luck, answer that question. So at this point we could say, well, the species we need to worry about here are C and D. So what we've done just recently is to look at the distribution of species up and down estuaries, and we've looked at 8 estuaries in total, 2 in the Southampton region and 6 here in the southwest, including the Dart. And we're basically finishing up this practical work at the moment, and when it's complete we'll need to basically compare the data from the different estuaries on species distributions and try to draw general conclusions about the distribution of particular species up and down estuaries. So this shows our survey sites along the Dart. The yellow pins are where we visited floating pontoons, mostly around the lower end of the estuary around Dartmouth, but also Baltic Wharf just down from Totnes. The green pins we accessed from the land at low tide, so we went on the shore at low tide, and these were done, as I said, from the land with the exception of Sharpham Reach, which we visited from Totnes by canoe thanks to Nigel and Tamara Mortimer. So this is the Dart divided into 8 rather arbitrary sections for the purposes of the talk based on where we were able to survey. And here are data for 11 non-native species. This is a kite diagram, so-called, whereby the thickness of the line reflects the abundance of the species in a given section of the estuary. The unthickened bits of the line are where a given species was not recorded. And you can see that the species do differentiate quite clearly according to where they occur along the length of the estuary. On the left there are two open sea species which barely penetrate up into the estuary. Further to the right we have species which reach a peak somewhere along the length of the estuary and are truly estuarine species. I've included one species, the third from the right, which is a freshwater species coming down in the opposite direction into the estuary, so it's a freshwater species penetrating to only a limited extent down into the estuary. Now for the rest of the talk I'm going to just single out some of the species that are shown here for particular comment, and I'm going to start with the two species on the extreme right, which, as you'll see, each occur along a considerable part of the length of the estuary, and these are in fact two species of barnacles. So in the Dart, and this is typical of the situation in British estuaries in general, the only barnacles found high up in the estuary are actually non-natives. So on the left is Darwin's barnacle, which came in during the Second World War on ships from New Zealand that were held up in port during the war. The Bay barnacle on the right actually goes back much further. It goes back at least to the 1850s, but it's thought to be native to the Western Atlantic. And both of these are fouling organisms. They're very happy to grow on artificial substrates, including boat hulls. The Bay barnacle is much more strongly constructed than Darwin's barnacle and is much more difficult to get off if you're trying to clean them off something. These are both abundant around Stoke Gabriel, say Duncannon, Stoke Gabriel area, and the bottle shown here is from there and is liberally coated with both species. But they also occur on natural substrates too. So here's a slab of rock in roughly the same place, again with a good covering of barnacles. And then of course there's Pacific oyster, which I guess is well known as a non-native, which is having an effect, if you like, on local estuaries, including the Dart. So this is the main commercial oyster. According to our visits, it seems to reach a peak somewhere in the sort of middle part of the estuary. On the right, a couple of the effects that it can have are illustrated. The bottom picture on the right shows an aggregation of oysters with the shells sort of growing vertically up with the sharp edges facing upwards, which is potentially quite dangerous. Say you fall over, or say you step off a boat into shallow water without realizing what you're going to be treading down onto. The smaller pictures above show that it can weld stones together into larger concretions and so alter the stability of the shore to some extent as well. Now this is carpet sea squirt, Didemnum vexillum, or D-vex for short. It's one of the most potentially troublesome marine non-native species that we have. It grows as a sort of blob or sheet and can expand sideways to cover whatever is next to it. It's native to the northwest Pacific, probably originating from the Japan region. It's been in the UK since 2008, when it was found in North Wales and then very shortly afterwards in the Dart at Kingswear. And we do have photographic evidence taking it back to 2005 in the Dart. It's a lower estuary species in the Dart as far as its distribution has been so far. The furthest up we found it is Nos Marina, and so it's in the sort of Dartmouth, Kingswear region. And in terms of what you can find from the surface, say on the floats of pontoons and so on, it seems to have blinked on and off over the years, perhaps associated with strong freshwater inflows which knock it back in the upper layers, but perhaps the populations further down in the water column are more consistently present, but we haven't really been able to explore that very much. It's been in Ireland since 2005, and this shows a couple of shots of it in Galway Bay. The top one is on the sort of downward facing or vertical face of a large rock, and the lower image is on oyster trestles hanging off the bottom of the oyster pillows in Galway. And you see that it does this strange thing on a downward facing surface of more or less dripping off, these long sort of tendrils coming down and dripping off, and the bits that drip off can establish on the seabed and carry on growing. In New Zealand, particularly in the northern part of South Island, New Zealand, where there's a long rope mussel culture industry for green-lipped mussels, it's been a severe nuisance to that industry. And you can see here a mussel rope brought up on board with all of the tendrils of didynum hanging off it, and so there's a very big mass, a very big weight of sea squirt very often, and it will grow over and smother to the mussels. But the industry is managing to live with this organism. It hasn't managed to exterminate it, but it is living with it, and it's just an ongoing nuisance. So this organism will also foul hulls, and so this is a photo in Ireland of didymnum dripping off a yacht hull, and this is again another cause of expense and nuisance as an organism that will grow very vigorously on a yacht hull. The last animal I want to talk about is trumpet tube worm or coral worm, Phacopomatus enigmaticus. This forms these white chalky tubes, only 2 or 3 millimeters wide. The worm itself has a crown of tentacles that it can feed with, and there's a plug or lid which seals the tube when the worm withdraws. The tube undergoes these growth stops along the length of the tube, where it flares out looking like the end of a trumpet. The tubes are small, but co-settlement of numerous worms can form large masses. On the right I show an anode which has been heavily colonized by trumpet tube worm, and now here is the sort of reef-like structures around the edge of Millbrook Lake in East Cornwall. The lake obviously has been drained at this point, showing these thick concretions of tubes which can be up to 30 centimetres deep. The River Itchen in Southampton has a region where it's very heavily infested, if you like, by trumpet tube worm, and these 2 photographs show an oil spill response boat which is berthed on the Itchen, and with these very thick growths on the hull at the top, but also around the propellers. And where a boat has been in the water for a while unused, growth of trumpet tube worm can basically sort of seize or jam the propeller. Our own survey of the Dart has really only shown small numbers below Totnes, but also in Mill Pool at Stoke Gabriel. But even here the population is fairly sparse, and we do wonder whether these populations that we've seen are self-sustaining, or whether actually they're just sort of spillover from a much larger population somewhere, and which we haven't found. And it would be very interesting to know if anybody has seen this worm in good numbers anywhere within the Dart estuary. And I wanted to draw attention to a compilation of information on marine non-native species by Rapid Life, which is a European project, and the link to this information is there at the top of the page. It includes basic information on marine non-native species, the writing of biosecurity plans in various contexts, also control measures and legislation in relation to marine non-natives, and it's very well worth having a look at. Lastly, just to say thank you to site owners or operators for allowing us access to do the surveys. Also to Nigel and Tamara Mortimer for taking us on a couple of memorable canoe trips to access inaccessible areas, and also a word from our sponsors, the Bromley Trust. We're very grateful to the Bromley for having funded quite a large proportion of our work over the last 5 years. Unfortunately, their logo now looks like this because they've dropped their environmental portfolio.
Okay.
I'm muted, Nigel.
I've obviously got layers of mute. I unmuted the button here, but not on the screen. So sorry about that. Thank you very much, John and Chris, for that. There are no questions that haven't been answered on the meeting chat. Are there any questions that you'd like to ask John or Chris, please? Mike, I see you've got your hand up. If you want to unmute yourself and ask the question.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, John and Chris. Yeah, I just got a question about, we understand a lot of the disadvantages of these invasives. Does something like the carpet sea squirt have any biodiversity benefits, you know, for the estuarine habitats in this part of the world, or is it all sort of bad news?
Well, the carpet sea squirt, we haven't heard of any benefits of it. I mean, some of the others say Phecopomatus has been talked about as a method of cleaning water because it filters quite a high volume, and it provides habitat for lots of little invertebrates, amphipod type things and things. But I don't know, John.
No, what Chris was referring to there was the trumpet tube worm, the
Yeah.
white chalk tube worm that we were talking about. Well, I mean, it is all additional biodiversity after all, so in a way, if we don't hold it against it that it's here because of us rather than naturally, then these things aren't necessarily inherently bad. But I mean, everything is food for something else. But the problem with non-natives is that very often they're relatively unconstrained by enemies or parasites or pathogens that they've left behind on the journey from wherever they've come from. And so they have a sort of an advantage for a while over the native species, which have all their friends and enemies around them still. But I mean, some non-native species are exploited commercially, or certainly exploitable commercially. Many have actually been introduced because they are commercial species anyway, either by escaping from culture or deliberate introduction into the wild. And so there are ones you can point out which have financial benefits as well as costs, certainly.
Well, the Pacific oyster is an obvious one, yeah.
Sorry?
Over time, do we expect, you know, the next ship that empties its tanks in Stark Bay will bring the predator for the carpet sea squirt or something similar? And over time, do you think these things will all balance out and you'll still end up with an
there is quite a common phenomenon, which is that a species, when it arrives, has a sort of flush phase. Well, it may have a lag phase to get going, but then it sort of bursts out and is kind of unconstrained and reaches seemingly unnatural densities, but then ultimately drops back somewhat, and that's probably because things are starting to target it from the fauna and flora that's around it, you know, competitors or things that can exploit it for food or what have you. I mean, for instance, when new large seaweeds come in, very often they seem to be growing very clean with nothing very much exploiting the space on them, but eventually they start to build up epiphytes, as you might call them, things growing on them, using them as a platform much more, and they've kind of become more of a general citizen rather than something which is running wild. Sorry? Okay.
Thank you for that, Mike. Rosemary Speed.
It was just following on from that, because that was the line of questioning I was going to make. is you ask if people cite these, particularly the trumpet tube worm, to let you know, but then you're not going to take action against them, I take it. It's a monitoring thing at this stage.
There would be a possibility of trying to manage a population such that it didn't get out of control. Because when you see what a nuisance it can be in some places, you'd have to think quite hard about the possibility of managing it. Or conceivably, depending on the setting it was in, you might consider the option of trying to eradicate it. It would need to be thought about, basically, in terms of, but when it really gets going, it seems to be benefited by warm summers. There was a summer a few years ago where we were getting reports of it being a real nuisance, principally in marina basins and often in enclosed basins with a lock gate, and which would get quite warm in the summer, but it was a warm summer anyway, and it was really becoming a headache, and it does seem to reproduce more efficiently when with a warmer year. So I mean, it's always a controversial thing, not so much for these little invertebrates, but obviously people get upset if you say you want to eradicate this or that mammal, for instance, or bird, and it really depends how much of an optimist you are that it's not going to prove to be a big headache, even though it hasn't been so far. I mean, I think we've got away with it here in this country to some extent, in terms of every species that comes in is kind of a gamble, really, in terms of how it's going to turn out as a citizen, if you like to call it that. And up until arguably Pacific oyster, we haven't really had anything which has become a major concern. But first thing to notice is that things are still coming in. You might think that things would be slowing down by now, but they're not. We're probably seeing an accelerating rate of arrival. And every species that we let in could conceivably turn out to be that real nightmare that we haven't really had yet.
I mean, I would just like to say, I'm writing a risk assessment at the moment for a sponge species, and you think sponges, you see them on the shore, they're not. This one is in the Estuary in the Netherlands, and a single colony can be 25 square meters large. So if you think about that, and if you look at the videos of Didendum vexillum, the carpet sea squirt, off the shore at Kent, and you see it smothering the seabed, then you can see these things and it depends very much where they are. I mean, they can be, like the carpet sea squirt is not really causing any problems in the Dart, but it might be carried by a boat to somewhere else that it can really kick off, so.
And it might yet prove to be a problem in the Dart as well, because things do, undergo population changes, and heaven knows what triggers them half the time.
Do you share information with Europe and, well, internationally maybe, but with Europe? Because are they having the same problem as we're having?
Oh, yes. I mean, within a European context, the main example is the Mediterranean, which is a real melting pot. And of course, that's mostly to do with things coming through the Suez Canal. So the Eastern Mediterranean, but not just the Eastern Mediterranean, is really being affected by non-native species from the Red Sea. And I think that, I can't remember these large figures that get bandied about, but I think they're pushing 700 non-native species, marine species in the Mediterranean now. And
I mean, a lot of our research, a lot of species that we get in are coming from Europe. They've invaded Europe to start with, and are now coming across the channel on your cross-channel ferries and, our yachts that we take across to Roscoff in the summer, so.
Thank you. Tom Hutchinson, please.
Yeah, hi everyone, and John, Chris, really thank you for a really enjoyable talk. I just was interested to focus in on the invasive oyster. This isn't my specialism of biology, as you know, mine's more about chemicals in water, but from what I've heard indirectly over the years, the Pacific oyster, or the invasive oyster, is a really huge issue. Isn't it changing literally the type of ecosystems on the Dutch coast, which is in turn affecting native shellfish and in turn affecting wading birds?
Yes,
so I know it's an easy question to ask, but would the invasive oyster be your number one invasive species concern in the Dart, or in your personal view, would it be another?
Well, I mean, something that we didn't really mention because it occurs more deeply. The slipper limpet in the Dart is a big problem, and I mean certainly in the Tamar system here in Plymouth, the abundance of slipper limpets in the deeper channels has actually caused the good environmental status of the Plymouth Sound and Estuaries SAC to be somewhat downgraded. And so that's another big one, which it goes back further. It was also an introduction with oysters, with the Chesapeake Bay oyster back in the tail end of the 1800s or the beginning of the 1900s, depending on which actual incursion stuck. But I mean, I think that the Pacific oyster is going to be seriously modifying habitats, and it is spreading. It is benefiting from the warming trend. Its reach is extending perceptibly with the warming trend, and so I think that's going to be, and I mean from an amenity shore, it really is quite unpleasant. You know, in terms of the scope for cutting yourself very badly on it is quite considerable, and it is just wholesale altering shores and turning them into something else, which is not necessarily intrinsically bad in itself, but it is affecting, you know, protected features of you know, conservation areas and so on and so forth. So it probably is the main one. I mean, I think we've probably yet to see the real misbehaviour that Didymnum vexillum carpet sea squirt is capable of. There's a drift dive video on YouTube off Herne Bay. Chris mentioned this, North Kent, where they're just drifting downstream with the tide across probably 50% carpet sea squirt in some places, just covering the seabed. And it's done that in big areas on George's Bank off sort of the northern end of the eastern seaboard of the States. Again, it's just modifying what's there. It's just, if there's enough of it to sort of determine the nature of the environment, as it were, to change the nature of the environment.
Could I ask you another quick follow-up question, Nigel? I know other people want to speak, or would you rather I waited?
Sorry. No, carry on.
So only a very quick one. So with the sea squirt, theoretically, John, could there be, you know, if we could get our native fish populations increased and predators on some of these soft-bodied invertebrates, is there some hope that in time a feeding relationship would actually help us with that? It might be a bit abstract, whereas the Pacific oyster is such a bulletproof organism.
Yes.
Different one.
Well, we don't really have fish, unlike North America, we don't really have fish that specialize in eating tunicates as such, Ascidians as such. And the didymnids, like Didymnum vexillum, are a bit of a challenge because they have a very low, they actually incorporate very acid liquids into the tunic. Some didymnids have a surface pH of 2, which is presumably primarily an anti-fouling device, but it does deter sort of grazers, as it were, snails and things that graze it. I mean, I guess probably Didymnum, like I was saying before, I guess Didymnum will probably gather some natural dependents, enemies, whatever you want to call them. I mean, certainly it does get very heavily, it's heavily colonized by gastropods, which lay their egg sacs in Didymnum vexillum, like they do in many other didymnids. So it's not immune, and they're obviously adapted to what Didymnum does to deter that. So I mean, it may well be that ultimately it does sink back into being more of a sort of a good citizen, which just takes its place in the community, which has happened for others. There's a big Japanese sea squirt called Stela clava, which is the earliest non-native sea squirt we had arriving, which was during the Korean War in the 1950s, and it came into Plymouth Dockyard. Apparently, it was discovered outside Plymouth Dockyard, and for a while that was really, really abundant. And one of our colleagues was doing their PhD on a native sea squirt, and they had to change their PhD because basically this other thing just took over completely. But now you don't see it that much; it's just there in reasonably normal numbers, and seemingly not really making too much of a nuisance of itself. So we kind of have to hope for that, really.
Okay.
But I mean, I must say, I'm still rather rattled at the thought of the homogenization of the biota which is happening. If it's certainly true for marinas these days. If you go to a marina anywhere temperate in the world, more or less, you'll see the same suite of species that get on very well in those places. And I mean, I think we all value diversity. We all like the idea that you can go somewhere else and see something different. And obviously this is eroding that to some extent. We're having this homogenization, which I think personally is sort of an inherently bad thing in its own right.
Yeah, I would personally agree. It is a bad thing. It's a sad thing, but it's a reality, and we have to find to do something. But thank you. That was really great. I'll stop, and obviously other people. Yeah, thank you.
Sorry,
Thanks,
Chris, I'm not giving you a look in.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Can I ask Kate Hills if you'd like to ask your question, please?
Hello, John and Chris. You did great work on the dart. Well done. I wondered if you're doing long-term monitoring to get the baseline data to see what is happening, disadvantages, I'm assuming. And do you work with the landowners where the invasives are identified?
Not well.
We certainly tell marinas what we found during our surveys in marinas and harbours. We've done a project recently in the Solent, and it's still on my list of things. We have actually told the landowners there what species were found on the shore. We haven't done that yet for the dart, although we have made Nigel aware of the different species that we found. Yeah, I mean, we're not necessarily planning to go back to the estuaries again. Well, finances can ban it really, but marinas we have revisited a number of times around England and Wales. So we have a picture of how things change over time. Unfortunately, it's always a question of trying to get funding for these things. But I mean, there is a push to for national monitoring of hotspots, and with the introduction of DNA testing, actual surveys of these sites could be repeated with water samples and things like that, instead of actually having taxonomists on the ground. So there's ways forward, yeah.
No, that's interesting. I'm going to show my complete ignorance of marine invasives. I know with terrestrial and freshwater invasives that it's not illegal to have them on your lands, but it is illegal to let them spread off your land. So how the heck does that work with marine species?
Virtually impossibly.
Does that legislation still apply, or does it not apply to marine species?
It does, in the sense that there was an issue in Scotland where the Didymnum vexillum was found in an oyster farm, and a control order was introduced on that farm. But within England and Wales, no such orders. There isn't the intention, although the legislation is there, it isn't the intention to put it into action.
There are things called species control agreements and species control orders, as I'm sure you know. But as far as we can tell, as Chris has just said, a decision has been taken really not to employ those possibilities, those options in a marine context.
Okay.
Mainly because who is responsible? With a landowner, it's on their land, but in a marina, is it the ship it's on, or is it?
Or the Crown Estate, or the Duchy of Cornwall.
Something to think about. Thank you.
As we're amongst friends, could I be a bit cheeky and to be transparent? I mean, it's one thing having the orders legislation, but if there's such cuts in the funding for different agencies to do the monitoring, then it doesn't mean anything. And I think we're all beholden as a community estuary forum to tune into the reality of how severe the budget cuts have been into our public sector organisations to monitor and protect the environment. And I think it's a party political point. It's just a reality of, if you can't implement legislation because you haven't got the staff to do it, you can see the quandary that the government can be in. Indeed, that we're all in a sense. But that's a personal view.
The agencies are right up against it, aren't they? Yeah. I agree with you entirely. I mean, another thing to say is, you asking about monitoring. Well, open-ended long-term monitoring is probably the most difficult thing to get funding for. You know, just to say it's worth monitoring, we need to carry on monitoring, it's telling us things we need to know. Okay, so, you know, when you're going to stop them? Well, the idea is just to keep it going because it needs keeping going. That's just so difficult. I mean, basically funding is in 1 year, 2 year or 3 year lumps, and keeping something going for any period of time is very, very difficult. And I mean, at the moment, we don't really have any funding to do any more monitoring is what it amounts to. You know, that may change, but it's really just a matter of trying to string it together as best you can, but getting continuity is extremely difficult. I mean, we work very closely. I mean, we're working with CFAS at the moment, and we do a lot of work with the GB Non-Native Species Secretariat, you know, to work on this sort of thing. But, you know, you're perfectly right, yeah.
Can I
Thank
ask,
you.
John, Christine, do you know, are they still issuing licenses for new Pacific oyster farms to be established in estuaries that do not currently have them?
Nigel might know more about the Pacific oyster than we do. Nigel, do you?
Unfortunately, I think they still can be, but I know the dominant landowner in that area, the Duchy of Cornwall, they appear to be favouring mariculture of native oyster where they can now. That's what they would rather now see.
I did have a question at the end of the summer from someone working for DEFRA who asked me, Keith, we've got an application for a licence for an oyster farm in an estuary which doesn't currently have Pacific oysters in it. Should we issue it or not? Well, you know what I said, of course not. But the fact that they're actually asking that question was quite remarkable. Of course, you don't issue a license for Pacific oyster farm in an estuary which doesn't currently have them.
Yeah, just one thing on that point, because most of the exports of shellfish go to Europe, and there's currently this problem with exporting shellfish to Europe. There's not going to be very many licenses for any sort of aquaculture in the near future.
Graham Price, your question, please.
Thank you, Nigel. I'm sorry, the presentation kept crashing out on me, but I saw and appreciated the good presentation as much as I saw. Yeah, I'm from Kingsbridge, and you mentioned early on, I think, that you'd done another survey down here somewhere. Question is, where was it? And the species you saw, were they similar to those that you saw in Dartmouth?
I bet I can't remember them all now.
Well, we've seen, I mean, we've done the, I mean, if you're talking about Salcombe Kingsbridge estuary specifically, we have surveyed that in the past quite frequently, and we have lists of species from there, which are actually
not going very far up the estuary, though. We were
no,
really
but the species but the species that we found in the Dartmouth Kingsbridge estuary were included in the biosecurity plans that we worked with Nigel on a few years ago. But the estuaries we did this time are the Team, the Dart, the Tamar, and the Plym, and the Yelm.
And the fowl.
And then 2 in Southampton. Oh, the fowl, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if I may just come in here, I was particularly interested because ours, of course, is a RIA.
Yeah.
You haven't got a river running into it. And I was just interested to know if the species were, you know, what you found was similar to what you saw in the Dart.
Much more marine species, you know, because like you say, there's not really any freshwater input to it. Yeah, I mean.
But we haven't surveyed all the way up, have we?
No, not to the tidal limit.
The current set, which was expressly sort of looking at the landward limit of species to some extent.
I mean, we mainly excluded it for that reason because it has such a low freshwater input to it.
Thank you for that. Chris just mentioned the biosecurity plan that we worked on some time ago, and it was updated just recently. And I'll put a link to the Dart estuary biosecurity plan on the meeting chat. And there is also a Salcombe Kingsbridge estuary biosecurity plan as well. Graham, don't forget that the Dart is also a RIA estuary too. It's more that the Salcombe Kingsbridge estuary just doesn't have a river flowing into it. Most of the estuaries in the southwest are these RIAs or drowned river valleys. One question from the chat, and then I think we'll call it a close for this section so that we can have the talk from Sharpham, is are there any restrictions on the discharge of ballast water, please?
Well, there are new, obviously, regulations come in about ballast water now. As far as I understand it, if it's come from a different country, then they're not allowed to discharge unless it's treated. Is that right, John?
Well, I mean, for ships of a certain size, you have to have an onboard water treatment plant effectively. But you need to keep a logbook of your use of that and discharge and uptake of water and so on, which can be inspected by the port of destination. And there is scope for testing of ballast water prior to allowing discharge, but one major problem with that is how long it takes, and obviously ships in port need a quick turnaround. But there's a whole series of tests for the number of particular microbes per unit volume, all the way up to different larger size body organisms for the quality of water which can be discharged. But I mean, there's a limit on a lower limit on the size of the ship to qualify for having to have ballast water management like that. So I don't know how much that would affect ships coming in and out of, in and out of Dartmouth or something, to be honest.
And it doesn't apply within the UK from going from one port to another. So if something is brought in one place, it can be, it can be transferred from one place to another place within the UK. And also, although the ballast water might be treated, their hulls aren't. So, whatever comes in on their hull is, has a chance to escape.
There is scope for exemptions on ballast water monitoring for ships which ply a single route backwards and forwards. It involves weighing up the presence of non-native species at each end of the route and the environmental match between the ports, the two ports, whether a species from one port could survive in the other. So there's scope for exemptions, but I'm honestly not very sure how much of that is actually taking place. That would involve quite a detailed knowledge of the biota at opposite ends, and it may well be that it's probably more trouble than it's worth.
I always think of the dinosaur film when I hear that, and that biology will always find a way.
Yeah, yes. Yes, exactly.
Can I say thank you very, very much to John and Chris for the presentation. If you can find it quickly enough, there is a clap function, but I think we'll just take a wave for this. So thank you very, very much for that. Next, I have great pleasure in welcoming Jack Skuse and Mike Cook of Ambios, giving us a talk about their Rewilding at Sharpham project in partnership with the Sharpham Trust and their 3-year National Lottery Heritage Fund Award project. And Sharpham Wild for People to make more space for wildlife and take action for nature. And again, if I can please ask Jack and Mike to introduce themselves at the beginning. Many thanks. Over to you, Jack and Mike.
Many thanks, Nigel. And thanks to John and Chris for that wonderful presentation first up. It was really fascinating. So my name's Jack Skuse from Ambios. I'm farm manager here on one of the tenant farms on the Sharpham estate. And I'm here to talk to you about rewilding at Sharpham. I'm going to share a screen just to get started. Okay, hopefully you can see that. So rewilding at Sharpham. I think for me, coming into this, I was acutely aware. I've been farming on the Sharpham estate for nearly 10 years and working here for longer still. And all the while, I think, becoming increasingly aware of numerous emergencies and scenarios, I guess, that seem to create despair, from climate change to biodiversity loss to mental health crisis. The world seemed quite bleak, I suppose. And having a young family, plus a sense of obligation for being responsible for land and wanting to leave a legacy to my children, I guess I was looking for opportunities and overall, I suppose, hope. And what I've found, I think, from working at Sharpham and from the opportunities that are presented here, came an opportunity to take on an additional piece of land adjacent to the land that I was farming at the time, 80 acres of permanent pasture. And so today I really wanted to talk a little bit about what that project looks like. And to step back to start with, to introduce a little bit about rewilding. So what is rewilding? Rewilding Britain state that rewilding is the large-scale restoration of ecosystems where nature can take care of itself, seeks to reinstate natural process and where appropriate missing species, allowing them to shape the landscape and the habitats within. So this sense of despair at the state of the world, I suppose, and about lots of the issues that we're facing as a species and we're noticing within our world. You know, I was looking for something that we could, you know, that would sort of look to change that, I guess. And this sense of rewilding became something that, you know, I really felt quite passionate about. And within the team here at Sharpham and on the Ambios board, we're tenants of the estate here. The opportunity to take on a bit of additional land presented to us, and I wanted to just shape a little bit about what that land looks like. So it's the 50 acre plot that we've been talking about is historic listed parkland, set obviously within the South Devon area of outstanding natural beauty. It's a really highly visible and sensitive landscape with, you know, different values. It's been in intensive agriculture for a number of years with improved and semi-improved pasture, but its heritage and its ecological value are really in a degraded state. And by that, I mean the listing that's placed on the landscape is based on a time around the 1800s, 1780 to 1800, 1810. And this listing, the parkland that was designed at this time and where the listing is really sort of keying into, is typical of that era. And so, and it would have been classic parkland with grazed pasture and trees within, where the sort of owners of the time and their visitors would pass through and enjoy the views of the beautiful landscape. But that heritage was really in a degraded state, where a number of the trees and the viewpoints were no longer really that visible. And so, as was the ecology, really, it was an intensively farmed dairy farm, which in a non-organic status. And so we were looking to do something with that. And by us, I mean Ambios, the organisation I'm working for, United Response, who I partner with here on the holding at Sharpham, who are a charity for adults with learning difficulties, and the Trust, plus numerous other stakeholders, including the AONB, Natural England and Historic England, who had a vested interest in this landscape and wanting to see this restoration happen, really. And so the opportunity to take on the additional 50 acres and to set about rewilding it sort of came to pass. And we approached the National Lottery to try and sort of pump prime the project to give us a really good launch into what we hope will be a long-term regenerative restoration of our part of the estuary. And we were successful in that project, which gave us sort of a platform really to talk to the local community, to work with lots of educational, to deliver lots of education to local schools and groups and interested parties, and to run numerous events. Of course, the project has had a slightly slow and checkered start, but we have managed to deliver on a few objectives. And And on the 1st of April in 2020, we took management responsibility for Home Farm for a 5-year period. So rewilding at Sharpham on 50 acres. The essence of rewilding is to really allow natural processes to happen. But what does that mean? And does that really mean you do nothing? Well, of course, in allowing natural processes to happen, our approach was really to step back on the management, to allow time to pass and to allow the ecosystem to recover and to sort of show itself a little bit. And for me, being a sort of farmer and land manager, of course, one of the hardest things I found to do was to do nothing. Of course, we weren't doing nothing. We were observing the land, and we were doing some interventions. We spent numerous hours surveying our farm to understand the makeup of the ecology and the grasslands and the woody species that reside therein, so that we have a really strong baseline. And you'll see some of what that looks like with Mike shortly. We did some management, and we took some intention to cut hay on some of the pasture land. And also over this initial period from April, when we took responsibility for the land, to now, has given us a lot of time to plan, really, to plan our monitoring and survey program. So Ambios is a nature conservation training organization where we host long-term or 12-week traineeships here on our farm, where students come to learn the basic skills for, hopefully, for a career in nature conservation. A lot of survey work, a lot of public engagement, a lot of project management, and the nuts and bolts of really, the ecological sector. And so our students really needed somewhere where they can practice and learn these skills. And so we've spent a lot of time really developing a survey program where the students can learn some skills about survey and then to carry them out on the holding. We also spent a lot of time trying to look at what our business model would be. We knew that in taking on a 5-year lease on a parcel of land that wouldn't necessarily see a classic agricultural return in true economic sense, it was really important for us to generate a model, I suppose, where we were seeing a return from the land in different ways, and being able to ensure that public access and a lot of the other values of the countryside were honoured and established, and we could access subsidy monies through the stewardship initiative through Natural England. And of course, the business model as well pointed us towards rural diversification. Our training and education model of long-term traineeship placements, along with our partnership with United Response to offer support for adults with learning disabilities within the care and wellbeing sector. And the reality, of course, was that we needed to pay our rent. As tenants of the trust, we had an obligation to obviously to manage the land in certain ways, and we set a lot of hairs running in taking on a rewilding project within the Dart. And so, we needed to make sure that it wasn't flash in the pan, that we were here for the long term, and that we could make a sustainable business out of it. And so, in accessing project money through the lottery and finding diversified sources of income, the business model started to take shape. And so our approach to managing the land here at Sharpham was to try and find a holistic agreement which married up the heritage and the important cultural value of the landscape along with the ecological value, to try and restore a degraded parkland and obviously to restore a valuable ecosystem. And the question we kept coming back to and trying to answer really was this a compromise, or was this a realistic and sustainable balance, and something that could potentially be a model for others to follow? So over this time, we developed a management plan, which we ensured had stakeholder buy-in, and we worked quite closely with numerous stakeholders here. So we started by removing all the fences within the holding, or a lot of the internal fences, dividing up the pasture land to allow stock to move freely within the holding, across the holding. And one of our trainees who helped in the removal of those fences wrote a wonderful blog, which I encourage you to look at, and I'll share a link with shortly. So ensuring that the livestock are able to freely roam, to ensure the safety of the general public and of course of the stock. we really wanted to, the management plan was really pointing us towards restoring the historic landscape. So the viewpoints where historically people would stop and enjoy the vistas, as well as the bridge, which for those that know the walk from Totnes to Sharpham will know that the bridge has collapsed over flooding in recent winters. And so we really needed to restore this bridge. The degraded parkland also meant that 141 trees that were originally planted back in the time when the listing is sort of linked with are missing. And so we really wanted to restore the parkland by replanting these trees. And we wanted to convert to organic and bring in and manage native breeds of stock at risk. So as I said, our business model really was pointing us towards more of our long-term residential traineeships, where students who really want a career in nature conservation could come and join us and learn the basic skills and the fundamental foundations for pursuing those dreams. Where our business model kind of also draws on the rural economies that come from sort of farming and land management through diversification, through the care and well-being opportunities that we offer via our partnership with United Response for adults with learning difficulties, and the business of farm subsidies and grant funding, plus the agricultural income for us provided a sort of a melting pot of income streams, which allowed us to develop what we think is a strong business to go forward. And so we approached, the project of rewilding Sharpham, and we're still in the process of learning that, what that looks like, but principally allowing natural processes to happen. And we've drawn quite extensively from Rewilding Britain, who in order to sort of try and encourage rewilding, whole-scale rewilding, they come up with 5 principles: to support people and nature together, to create resilient local economies, to secure benefits for the long term, to work at nature's scale, and to let nature lead. And I just wanted to touch on some of these as we're looking forward to how in delivering our project here. So supporting people and nature together. Well, for us and Rewilding at Sharpham, as I've mentioned before, training the next generation of wildlife professionals on 12-week placements, to support United Response and inspiring others to come, as well as supporting the people that are already coming to the farm with things like citizen science, ensuring that the livestock are well managed, building wildlife boxes, perhaps developing tree nurseries, things like that. Through our project Wild for People, funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, supporting volunteers in planting trees and carrying out wildlife surveys, perhaps being creative. Trying to run inspirational educational events as the opportunities emerge post-COVID, and ensuring that as we see the change happening, as the landscape is restored, as we see wildlife return, that people can really engage with that, can see those changes, and we can ensure that there's interpretation and access throughout. Creating resilient local economies then. It's important really for us to understand the funding landscape and to see what opportunities come from rewilding for us and potentially for others through things like biodiversity offset, through environmental land management schemes for the rural communities and so on. It's important, as I said before, to try and model a business which manages land in different ways, I suppose, that offers employment opportunities in the rural landscape, so that other landowners can potentially learn from our experiences, and engage and trade with the local community as well, so that others in the cascade of the value and the benefit that we're seeing others can benefit from as well. And knowing our limits, really, knowing what we can do as the land managers and those responsible for the holding, and what others perhaps can offer, and we can work in partnership. Securing benefits for the long term. We want to recognise and ensure others recognise the value of rewilding. So the ideas of public money for public good. the rural subsidy schemes change within the UK post-Brexit, there are massive opportunities for landowners to try and diversify their economies, to look at some of the marginal land and think openly about what the best value for that land might be. And this idea of ecosystem services and funding through the ELM scheme and others might mean that the priorities for some of the countryside are changed. And we can look at the other values alongside agriculture for the countryside, things like, you know, soils and carbon, for water, for biodiversity and for recreation. It's important also for us to understand and study the responses from rewilding. We heard earlier on the difficulties of gathering long-term data sets and robust science. And so it's really important that we utilize our position in having engaged and inspired young people coming to stay with us and to learn from us, as well as to carry out robust surveys so that we have data that captures the changes and we can evidence, you know, the impact of rewilding here at Sharpham. And we also want to make sure that we have a long-term view. So as tenants, of course, we have our bills to pay, but that we also want to be here in the long term. And so looking at a balance between, between sort of investing in infrastructure on the farm here, so that we have a long-term view and the benefits can last for the long term. And the trust and others can sort of be inspired by that and hopefully be reassured that that this is a credible and sustainable, rewilding is a credible and sustainable option. One of the other principles of rewilding is working at nature's scale. So being able to model a successful and diversified business is potentially scalable. If we're able to engage with local landowners via networks, including the Estuary Forum here, we can start to share and look at how the landscape may change intentionally rather than being done for us through the way the subsidies are changing. So being able to sort of plan and network and connect some of the habitats along in different sort of parts of the area, we can start working at a scale that's beyond our 50 acres. And the opportunities that come from that. It's not that it's without its challenge, and the changes that are coming, but there may be opportunities for us as landowners and land managers. And letting nature lead. Allowing natural processes with limited intervention. So we know when we're talking at on a 50-acre scale, we're not talking about the Yellowstone National Park or the Estuary or even NEP. We know that our levels of intervention, there are going to be levels of intervention, and getting the right stocking makeup is going to be important. And so we have to sort of learn our way into this. We want to try and, as far as we can, allow natural processes to happen. And we want to try and create the right conditions for that to happen, but we know that there's going to be levels of intervention. The stocking levels are going to be low to allow these sort of transition habitats between the woodlands that you see and the pasture that you see, and also different makeup of different grazers, mimicking these natural processes. And in taking our time means that we can learn as we go, so that rewilding is a new and what I find really sort of inspiring and progressive and potentially transformative approach to land management and restoring some of these despair stories, I suppose, that I started with. And so, we want to try and change the landscape and improve the landscape for wildlife and for people. And the lottery project that we're running, the Sharpham Wild for People, sort of encapsulates that and connects it with our audiences. But we really want to, learn our way into it, and so that, the learning over the lifetime of the project, we can really sort of translate further down the line. So sort of in a nutshell, we've got a 50-acre plot at Sharpham where we've been able to access a grant subsidy from the lottery to kickstart rewilding. I'm going to hand over to Mike, who's going to talk a little bit about what the landscape looks like and some of the habitats and the species that live therein, and then would really welcome some questions at the end. So I'm going to hand over to Mike.
Hello. Hi. Hope everyone can hear okay. I'm Mike. I I'm working with the trainees that we have here at Sharpham most of the time, and I've been working with Ambios on the projects here since for the last 10 years or thereabouts, doing a fair share of the training work here. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we can see on home farm, the rewilding area, over the last year, the changes that have happened, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the monitoring achievements that have happened here. So what the work we've done a lot of work, an awful lot of work this year to monitor the land. We're fortunate in having been able to carry on our work right the way through the COVID lockdowns, getting trainees in here. And so COVID hasn't actually sort of held up our monitoring objectives really. We've been able to crack on quite nicely through the year. I'd like to just point out also that Jack and myself we are bubbled together down here at down at Lower Sharpham Farm, and so that's why we're sharing the same computer. No problems for that with that for us here. Yeah, reassuring first year, and so let's just talk a little bit about the context of home farm. And it's on the Sharpham estate, on the banks of the Dart there. I'm sure that most of you are well aware, sort of familiar with this area. We are really sitting in a valley which is surrounded by quite intensively managed farmland, and this is a typical situation for the UK, of course, and for the South Hams. We've got intensively managed grassland and arable farmland in the local area, which you can see quite nicely on the Google image there. But most of the higher value habitats are associated with the valleys. So we've got not only woodland habitats along the margins of the Dart there. We've also got semi-improved grassland habitats on the steeper slopes, which are of better quality than the surrounding landscape. And of course, we have all of the intertidal habitats that are associated with the Dart as well. So really, the valley is where it's at in terms of biodiversity interest. This is the area of the home farm rewilding area. So we've got pretty typical kind of farmland, really, even though it's set in a really nice setting, and the views are spectacular. Intrinsically, the farmland itself that we inherited is quite sort of typical farmland composition. So most of the grasslands improved, some semi-improved pasture on the steeper slopes, say agriculturally improved rather than improved for nature, of course. So quite high levels of inputs of manure, etc., and quite limited numbers of species overall, or at least species diversity at least. And then the other elements, scrub and woodland. There were very few. There's only one hedge actually that's on. And we can drag this across. Yeah, this hedge here is the only hedge within the site, and the other habitats, the marginal habitats around the outside of the site, are woodland and scrub, and of course it's joining onto the river habitats too. A little bit of the upper salt marsh and reed bed kind of habitats there too, but quite diverse. And there's several veteran trees dotted mainly along the main track through the middle of through the site, which are dating from the original planting, we think. And so we have some sweet chestnut, some lime, and some beech trees, which are really very old, and oak as well. Yeah. So the context, it's right by the Dart. I'm sure there are people some of you guys out there know so much more about the River Dart than we do. Some simple things about the ecology. So obviously it's important for movement of species. It connects Dartmoor with the sea. we know about some important, some significant species using the dart as a flight line feature. So for the horseshoe bat, lesser horseshoe bat, greater horseshoe bat. Of course, we have fish interests, otters, and coastal birds, etc. So it is of importance to those species for movements. Again, I'm in dodgy territory talking about these things because it's not my area at all. But we have the marine conservation zone designation, of course, for the estuary. Scarce tentacled lagoon worm being a significant element of that designation. And then, yeah, we have semi-natural habitats associated with the Dart estuary itself. So we're right next to Home Reach Marsh, which is dominated by brackish reed bed, swamp and fringing salt marsh and intertidal muds. Just talking a little bit around the terrestrial, the non-marine elements here. We have a lot of specialist birds which seem to be increasing in numbers on in the marsh there. It's become quite conspicuous, and we've noticed quite big increases in things like reed warbler, sedge warbler. We're getting lots of water rail. We've got a sudden explosion of Chetty's warbler. It's really quite noisy with birds in a way that it wasn't a few years ago, actually. So that's quite interesting, and I'm really interested to know a little bit more about why that might be the case. And the marsh is designated as a county wildlife site, and also sits within the marine conservation zone. It extends across the area, the intertidal area of the marsh there as well, with all of its interest. So this is I'm going to present to you a sort of a vision of change over a 10-year period. This is a sort of vision that we put together a year ago when we first set out on this venture. And we're going to have a look and see how the landscape might look in 10 years with minimal grazing and a minimal intervention. So I think what we can see here is quite a static and fixed kind of landscape, quite typical of pasture land throughout Devon. Obviously short grass and with some woody vegetation, but very little in between really. And so in this sense, it's quite a binary landscape. You've got tall stuff and short stuff, not much in between. Not many gradients, not much going on ecologically over what we normally find in the pastured landscape. And in a sense, it's quite ecologically boring, I suppose. Certainly, it could be a lot more ecologically interesting, and that's where we're heading with our intentions for the land going forward. There are a few places for wildlife to be, really, in comparison with a much more diversified landscape. So I'm going to invite you to step into our time machine and just whiz forward by 10 years. So let's just see what happens. Okay, here we go. So I hope you guys can see this. This is trickery and fakery. It's deep fakery for the future. Yeah, I think what we can see here is something quite different and a very, very different feeling landscape. So we have no planting, planting is part of our, tree planting is part of our management program coming up in the next few years, but in this scene, it's not something that we've woven into that vision. But generally, a richer scene, as I'm sure you might think. So, in this vision, we have rebalanced grazing with vegetation growth, and here we can see some ponies adding to that mix. We've encouraged disturbance So using disturbing animals that's not the right way, but like pigs, that can be quite disturbing, I think, but to allow the development of diverse and dynamic vegetation with more places for our wildlife to live, giving nature a chance to flourish. So let's go back to December 2019 and just see what it looks like in comparison. So that was, yeah, one winter ago, 1 year ago. So quite a different scene, really. So I'm going to invite you to step back into our time machine and now go forwards for real by 1 year to the scene as it was a couple of weeks ago. So here we are 1 year on, and we're already seeing some changes, some quite encouraging changes. So more structure, tussocks starting to develop, margins starting to creep in. Yeah, we're starting to see quite an opening of the availability of niche space in the grassland there. And that's reflected in the observations that we've noted in across the fields over the last year. Here's a scene, so looking the same comparison, the same time period. So we can start to see some quite significant development of taller vegetation on the right-hand image, margins starting to creep outwards, tussocks starting to develop. And in this scene, we've got the taller vegetation starting to expand. Taller herbaceous vegetation starting to develop and sort of diversify the structure of this water bed. In this scene, we've got black knapweed, common knapweed, starting to spread. And here we can see, the tussocky musk, starting to develop, all that lovely structure starting to develop. We can see nettles, but the nettle's not really expanding in terms of their range, but it's certainly increasing in their persistence over the winter where it's been ungrazed. And this was how it was in high summer. I mean, an absolutely glorious thing to witness. This sudden flourishing of the grassland. Yeah, just quite a scene, really, seeing the flowers allowed to do their thing for the first time in a long time. Quite colourful, really. By late summer and autumn, the vegetation is starting to feel a lot wilder, as the grass starts to die back. And I sort of get the sense of the expansiveness, really. In the picture on the right, we've taken the fences out, which has sort of opened the vista up, and it seems that in some ways there's a kind of a sort of a connective feeling to connecting the moor with the valley. You get this sense of a much more natural vegetation rather than the shortly grazed green grass. And by the time we get to the winter, when we really start to see the structure being kind of expressed, the sort of skeleton of the vegetation starts to really show, and the tussocks have been developing the whole year through, and we're starting to sort of get this sense of mess and complexity, and certainly sort of feels like it's a much richer place for wildlife to be. We're noticing the first signs of woody regeneration around the edges of the fields. Lots of blackthorns starting to come up, and tree seedlings starting to come up, various different species, oak being one of them. Something that's really conspicuous, really, as the grass has grown up in the summer, is the sudden change in the sound of the place. Grasshoppers and crickets have been really taken off, really noticeably. It's very conspicuous, increase in numbers right the way across the open fields. And this insect on the left is the great green bush cricket, which is a mighty beast and a really good indicator of rough conditions, where you have interface between casually managed or unintentionally managed grassland and scrub. And we're finding actually in the open fields, and quite good numbers across the open fields, even into the first year. We've had them on home farm on the adjacent land for quite some time, but it's this year they've really taken off. And yeah, to see them in the open fields is, you know, there's no way you would have seen that before in the short grazed grassland. And so along with that, we're starting to see some changes in the birds using the farm. So a good increase in the number of seed-eating birds. They're making good use of the availability of seeds that are allowed to develop in through the absence of grazing. We're seeing the birds using natural perches, so the tallest bits of vegetation in the open grassland. The same is true for stone chats. We had 1 or 2 stone chats on the land. Previously, we occasionally recorded the stone chat using the margins of home farm, but now we see an expansion of territories right the way across the land. And again, they're making use of the availability of perches because they're perch hunters, but also most likely taking good advantage of the increase in the number of invertebrates, and in particular young grasshopper nymphs, etc. There seems to be a significant increase. It's only anecdotal, but a significant increase in the number of herondines and swifts feeding on small insects over the fields too. Quite an impressive sight, actually. Hundreds and hundreds of birds. Really nice to see. Icing on the cake, as far as the wildlife is concerned, has been the consistent presence of quite a few barn owls actually on the land. We know of at least 2 or 3 occasions where we've been seeing three individuals simultaneously feeding over the open grasslands, and there's no way we would have seen that before. We didn't see that before, and no way that could have happened before because of the short grazed sward. Kestrels also hunting over the open fields. We didn't see that before. We couldn't have seen that before. We've seen this is corresponding with a big increase in the number of voles, vole holes being present right the way across the open fields. That can only really happen where you're starting to build up a good depth of grass and a litter layer at the bottom of the grass. So the monitoring, it's been a busy year. And so hats off to our trainees who've done a huge amount of work, as Jack was saying. And we set out at the beginning of the year with a plan, a scheme for the monitoring through the year, and we've pretty much managed to achieve everything that we set out to do. So why do we want to monitor? What's it all about? Well, we need to evidence what we're doing. We need to be able to outwardly, show that what we're doing is beneficial, has value, and we need to be able to celebrate those outcomes too. We need to be able to keep ourselves going, to keep our stakeholders confident in what we're doing, and for us to actually just enjoy it and for it to be a rich part of all of our lives here. When we are keen to develop a working example of monitoring for rewilding, there is very little going on in the way of monitoring work in a systematic and thorough kind of way. Obviously, there is monitoring work going on with rewilding, but it's not concerted in any particular way so far, I don't think. And also, most important for us, it has to be an educational resource. We're an educational organisation. We're training the next generation of wildlife professionals, giving them the opportunity to get involved in very purposeful surveys with good onward value and experience for them in their careers. So designing the programme, we put quite a bit of thought into it. we need to really have the programme focusing on accessible wildlife. And by that I mean wildlife that can be found, wildlife that can be easily identified, wildlife that's in enough abundance to be able to give us some meaningful data. It doesn't help us to focus on very difficult, hidden, obscure organisms. We need to use indicators of change which we understand, which have good, well understood ecologies, things that can tell us something that we can interpret the results through and by. These things need to have some relevance to the public. There needs to be resonance with the public's imagination, with their values. So things that people recognize. Birds are a really good example of this. They really mean things to people. People have a sense of value in them. So that gives them some kind of political clout, some kind of weight when it comes to lobbying and that kind of thing. We're monitoring ecological change, so that's the ecological process, and of course that isn't just biodiversity. That's everything that biodiversity does, all changes that happen with the development of the habitat. So physical elements, soils, vegetation structure, and vegetation dynamics form part of the program. And for us, what we choose to look at really needs to have high educational value. And form a core part of our training program. You know, having a really good, applied, purposeful core element to our training is essential. It's really the core of our offer. The main things we looked at in 2020 then were vegetation. We looked at a few different elements of the vegetation, which we'll look at in a second. Birds, butterflies, bats, reptiles, dormice, and other mammals, earthworms. We also did fixed point photography and got some good drone footage for onward visual monitoring of the habitat change. And all of that was planned out at the beginning of the year, well actually for the next few years, as part of our training program. And as I said before, we've managed to complete most of it, which is good. I mean, considering COVID, we're quite pleased with that. But there have been some adaptations as we've gone through the year. So just a couple of those examples in a bit more detail. So for the vegetation, we essentially did habitat mapping. We mapped out all the grasslands with a similar composition, and we described each of the compartments separately. So we recorded the abundance of all species that we found in each of those compartments, and then we put to get some more some better quantitative data, comparative quantitative data. We did 110 quadrats using a 1 meter quadrat across all of that land, a 10 in each compartment, and that should give us a comparative change, a good comparison of change as we go forwards, quantified comparison. We also use that data, put that data into the Ellenberg Index, which is a way of being able to interpret soil conditions through the vegetation that grows on it. So that's given us a little bit of extra data there. We also did 6 fixed transects using NVC protocol, so the National Vegetation Classification System. So we have a way of being able to compare our vegetation to other vegetation nationally. We couldn't find any comparison actually, so there's no conformity to National Vegetation Classification community types that we can find any strong conformity at all in our grassland communities. That's not a problem. That's quite a normal situation, I think, with this kind of survey. But these are fixed transects, and they will remain in situ as we go forwards into the future. They're marked out with posts in the ground, so and those posts are pretty robust, so we shouldn't have any problems in coming back to exactly the same place each time when we do those onward surveys. And then finally, we surveyed the boundaries. We did recorded each one separately with a verbal description, all the species and then the abundance of those species, and recorded and photo documented each individual compartment. For the birds, we wanted to use, well, we want to use where possible any existing protocols, any industry standard protocols that we can, because that has a good educational value onwardly for our trainees. So we chose to use the BBS, the British Breeding Bird Survey transect method. We did 5 surveys in May and June. That's a transect right through the middle of the site, recording all the land in the site actually within that transect. And then we did we established 6 fixed point winter bird monitoring locations and points. We completed 4 complete surveys between November and January, and we're ongoing through February with our winter bird survey method. That's just recording all the birds that we find in the 15-minute periods within a 50-meter radius of those locations. So for 2021 and beyond, what's happening? Well, we're going to repeat quite a lot of our survey work as an ongoing monitoring thing. We're going to do soil surveys. That's in the next couple of weeks, actually. We've got a soil survey planned where we're taking samples right the way across home farm. This is important for tracing how changes will occur on the site, but also it gives us a really good upfront set of data for understanding our management options as we go forwards. So soil carbon is a big part of it. We're recording, we're analysing soil carbon with the survey, and hopefully we'll see an increase in carbon capture, all really important for evidencing the value of rewilding for that. Vegetation structure transects. So not only are we recording the species, but we're recording the actual the change in the structure of the vegetation over time, to the height of the vegetation along transect lines, and this should give us a good interpretation of the increasing value, hopefully, for all kinds of things. Audio monitoring is exciting. So there is an emerging technology around the use of sound, using sound to monitor the biodiversity of land, or of habitats. Just making a simple comparison between the sound of the site in 2021 compared to 2031 would be a very appealing kind of option, really. It could have a lot of value. Engaging United Response. The United Response is the organisation that one of our partners here, who run a daycare service for people with learning differences, and we try to engage them in our conservation work on the site as much as we possibly can. And there are options for them being engaged. And we're carrying out reptile surveys, for example, and this is some work that they can do with some support as a separate organisation, really. But they can take that on as a separate organisation, which is great. And also just to onwardly look for new possibilities, and really engaging with the public is a really good part of that, I think. Having the opportunity to be able to bring the local community into the process of recording it seems like an obvious thing for us to choose to do. And the Sharpham Wild for People funded project is also giving us some opportunity to get some funded research and direction on that. And we've made invitations to other organisations as we go forward too. So for universities to for example, to come to the site to use it as a monitoring opportunity. So all in all, a really reassuring first year. We've managed to achieve most of what we set out to do in the way of forward management and monitoring. And so yeah, I'd just like to thank you for that, and just to say that you can find out a lot more about everything that we've been doing here at our website and at the other addresses there. So thank you very much for that. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Jack and Mike. There's been a number of questions asked through the meeting chat, which I will go through. Phil Smith, hi Phil. Are you making any ponds or amending existing ponds? And do you need to reduce the nutrients in the topsoil?
Two great questions. Well, the bridge restoration, which you see as you walk from Totnes to Sharpham, is part of this sort of part of the heritage restoration works that we're embarking on, and that was flooded last winter when the wall subsided, and what we're looking at now is, as you see, there's been some works and there'll be some ongoing works in the coming months to rebuild the wall, and the culvert's been revealed. You'll also notice that some of the works that we've put in place to try and sort of manage the flow, the speed of water coming down, silting up and sedimenting up. So it's really opening up the question around ponds and around how to manage that bridge, and what we can do about the speed of water coming down. So there's a sort of there's currently a question around that. We haven't got an answer for it, but we know that there's some work to do around that, and the hope is that there'll be there could be some ponds that may go in place further up the stream to help manage the flow of that, but also the knock-on effect of that might be that the sort of flow down and the retaining of that, the bridge feature. So so I'm hopeful that there will be. In terms of managing nutrients in the grassland, you'll see that we cut hay in one of the lower fields, what we call Lower Brick Meadow, which is one of the the most improved, agriculturally improved fields. We're sort of making our management decisions. There was an original plan, and based on our sort of understanding of NEP and using that as a useful kind of example for us, because it's a similar lowland farm, where they planted barley and sort of drew out some of those nutrients. It's unlikely that we're going to do that, but we're considering kind of cutting hay and trying to reduce that nutrient load in those lower fields. But sort of overall, the approach is going to be minimal intervention, I think. Got anything to add?
Yeah, I have. Yeah. So the site itself is quite. I mean, the amount of manure that's been put on the land is quite local. Well, it's quite widespread, but it's within. There's a fair proportion of the site which has managed to escape the worst of that, and so it's not the whole site that we have to really worry about, I think, regarding soil nutrients. Yeah, there is one field in particular, and that's the one in which we've taken the hay cut from this year. So I mean, it is an option for us to continue doing that in the medium term. And one thing with all of this is that we really are in this for the long term, and so something like that could be a viable onwards form of management for us. Taking decades into consideration, we could reduce the nutrients there by cropping, but it's going to take quite a lot of time just by taking hay cuts off the grass.
Thank you. From Christine Wood, Will you be discouraging removing any non-native species that come in?
Discouraging removing. I don't think there's any need to discourage removing them. There are invasive species there. There's ragwort, there's thistle, there's bracken. There's lots of different things there which we might want to worry about. But something like obviously something like ragwort has got great value for wildlife, and we wouldn't want to lose it from the site. But I don't think that by some moderate management of of those things that we will impact so heavily on the populations that are there, not without really significant input. One thing that we are blessed with is quite a large and willing workforce of trainees and volunteers and service users from United Response. And so perhaps unlike many other sites, we do have the opportunity to be able to do a little bit of fine tuning, a little bit of pulling here and there where we think it would be most effective. And we were faced with the choice really when this last year, what do we do about the ragwort that's there? Actually, there wasn't that much that you could find, and it was clearable by a small team within it was two mornings. We managed to deal with everything that was flowering. We managed to pull up. Of course, there's twice as much, 3 times as much waiting to come up there in the grassland again. And so yeah, I don't think we're really worrying about those things so much, because we know that we're on site all the time and have a good opportunity to be able to make impacts just manually if we need to do so. We fully recognise the value of these species within the landscape. So yeah, I think that's where we're with that. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. From Dave Kerno, have you thought of green haying? That's almost difficult to say.
Green hay. Green hay. Yes. Yeah. Yes, we have thought about green hay. Another thing which we're blessed with is that we are home farm is right next to Lower Sharpham farm, which we've been managing under a high-level stewardship for the last 7 years, and we have some great grasslands here, and a really good source of green hay for spreading. It's something which we've got in our minds. It's something which we are thinking about. Well, we are considering for the time ahead. I think we were treating this last year as the opportunity to be able to get to know the land, to be able to understand what onward requirements might be for the restorative process. So that's what we've been doing. We've been looking and seeing, watching, interpreting, getting to know the land, and I think that these kind of decisions are things that we're facing now at the moment. I think this kind of decision making.
From Gillian Glegg. Hi, Gillian. Have there been any stock on the land over the last year or so?
We took the holding on in April, and we haven't put any stock on there since. So we've literally allowed this year to sort of as a recovery year and as a monitoring and survey year. What's coming next for us now that we have an agreement with Natural England for our countryside stewardship, we're looking to make the holding stock proof. We've removed a number of internal fences so that stock can move freely across the holding, both sides of the farm track. And so there'll be passing points along the lower farm track. And then now when that happens, which will be later this month and going into March, as soon as that happens, we'll be looking to introduce some stock at very small numbers. And that might include pigs to allow levels of disturbance to try and encourage some of the sort of the pioneering species to come back in and so on. And that will hopefully happen towards the end of March, beginning of April, where we will set aside a small part of the holding, a couple of acres, and introduce a couple of pigs for a short period of time to disturb the pasture land. And then the pigs will be removed and that will sort of inform quite a lot of our decision making for the future as to what levels of intervention we'd like to introduce, and whether the pigs can then sort of come in across the whole holding, and what that might look like and how long that might take and so on. So yeah, so this next year is really about understanding more about our management intervention levels. So a bit of a pilot with pigs, introducing a small number of different stock, and then with that we can learn an awful lot, and monitor the changes as we go along, as Mike explained.
Thank you. Gillian, did you want to follow up on that? I saw a wave. No, okay. Emma Rees, when you mentioned monitoring soil carbon, is this going to be done through assessing organic matter content?
No, it's going to be soil carbon. Yeah, I've forgotten what the full term is for it, I'm afraid, but it's soil carbon rather than organic matter. Yeah.
And there was a comment from Nick, would be good to record soil structure too.
Yeah.
Phil Smith asks, are deer an issue at Sharpham in relation to saplings at all?
There are deer. There are a small number of deer. Part of our mammal monitoring has been setting up stealth cameras, so we know there's a small number of deer here. They do graze, of course, on saplings, but what we've noticed within the pasture is that some of the saplings are actually doing quite well. Of the restoration works, we're obliged to fence off some of the trees that we're planting. So, like I said earlier on, we've got 140 trees to go in, and each of those will require stock-proof fencing. But then of the other saplings that will kind of emerge through the sort of lower grazing densities and some of the disturbance opportunities, it's about sort of seeing and monitoring those. I don't think the number of deer are so significant to make such a big impact here, actually.
Thanks. From Kate Hills, have you looked for harvest mice? Sarah Butcher from Devon Mammal Group has an online training video, and when allowed does outdoor training sessions on site.
We have one record of harvest mice, not actually on home farm itself, but immediately adjacent to it. And it was recorded by one of our trainees in 2012. We've done a lot of small mammal trapping around that area since, and further afield around the estate, and we found nothing. So we found no more evidence. That's as much as I can say, I'm afraid. There are no records otherwise. If you look on the NBN, there's no records in the immediate local area around Sharpham here. So yeah, I don't know what else to say about that. I mean, they may well be, there's a good chance they're here, but we're just not finding them. So yeah.
They're very under-recorded and can be hard to find. So do get in touch, because I'm sure she'd love to come down to your amazing looking site and help you. Okay.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great contact. But not one.
And sorry. And from Mike Peary, sorry, Mike, I'm only human. Will your soil surveys be investigating the microfauna and microflora elements in the soil?
Great question. Thanks, Mike. Yes, we're going to have a crack at it. We're going to have a go. But I think we're going to be limited to springtails, essentially, as our main thing. We're probably going to rely on any outside sort of investment in the site through universities, etc., for that kind of data. Our core offer, really, our offer of training offer here is a very broad-based naturalist skills kind of training. It's conservation training, but it's training people with the most commonly required skills by employers. And so something like soil fauna, unfortunately, doesn't really kind of sit in that scheme of things. That's sort of scope. So yes, outside outsourcing, yeah, is definitely the
thanks, Mike. No, just of course in Isabella Tree's book, you know, that chapter on soil and soil health and all the microorganisms is almost, you know, the seminal part of that whole wilding piece. And it strikes me as a farmer that, you know, as a farmer yourself, you know, when you get the soil guy person around to measure the soil, you know, you get a very basic look at some different elements of the soil, and that's it. And actually, you know, hopefully under elms and things, we'll get much better at looking in far more detail at what's actually going on in our soil, because that really is the key, I think, to all of this.
Yeah, right. I mean, we've started to do this last year. We did earthworm monitoring. So I think that, you know, if we're taking a practical approach to looking for these things, then you know, then having a good proxy is very, really important. And earthworms, I think we have to, for us here with our stuff here, we're relying on earthworms as being our proxy for soil health as much as anything else.
Okay, thanks.
I think if you'll allow me, I'll make this the last. Sorry, I can see there's a question from Roger. If you'd like to unmute yourself and ask the question.
Sorry, yeah, does this program have any impact on cheese production?
Great question. Do you want to get that?
Well, we're not running a dairy herd through the holding. So for Sharpham, the milking Jersey cows are long gone, and they're being milked at Dartington now. So hopefully we'll still be tasting the delicious Sharpham cheese long into the future. They just won't be grazing the Sharpham pasture.
Thank you. I'm going to try and wrap this up for 8 o'clock, if that's right with everybody.
Nigel, sorry, I just want to, I'm going to claim chairman's rights here, or just to make, you know, a much broader point. I mean, to me, the critical issue here is the legacy of this project. What happens not for the next 5 years, but what's going to happen for the next 20 after that. So, you know, and Jack and I and Mike and I have already had conversations about, hopefully some of you are aware of this, our plan to try and get a new walking and cycle path down the other side of the Dart, which takes in Fleet Mill Marsh just across the river from Sharpham, and then goes on into Aish and Stoke Gabriel, and hopefully eventually all the way down to Kingswear. And we're looking, you know, so it's this big vision stuff, which includes the educational opportunities of places like Wilding at Sharpham, also Fleet Mill Marsh, and hopefully we can get, you know, much more activity through the whole estuary of people on foot and bicycles to come and really learn and understand. The other thing I say as a farmer, you know, I don't know about Jack, but I am really pinning my hopes on environmental land management scheme coming in the way it's been designed. If that happens and it's fundable post-COVID, then, you know, nearly every farmer in the country will start to do his business differently. And we will see more trees and more hedges, and we won't see mud floods running through our villages and blocking up the drains, because they won't get paid any money if that's the way they're farming. So, you know, there is a massive potential with environmental land management schemes in the next 5 years to really radically overhaul our landscapes, the quality of the water in our rivers, and all sorts of other things. So, you know, if you get a chance to support elms, please, you know, write to the MP, just keep banging that drum about the importance of elms, because, you know, that is going to be a massive part of this in the years to come. That's it, Nigel.
Cheers. Oh, yes, I am talking. Phil Smith, any plans for bi-blitzes, say every 5 years?
Yeah, really good question. Thanks, Phil. We do have plans for bi-blitzes. The National Lottery Heritage Fund project is funding one a year for the duration of the project. So that's 3 years. We were hoping to have one yet last year. Of course, that didn't happen, and we've relied on the surveys from the trainees. Hopefully in September time, there'll be a bi-blitz. Phil, really encourage you to come and join us if you could, help with our marine ecosystems. Yeah.
And we'll make this the final one. No one waving. From Nick, digging a soil pit to record the structure of the soil would help to piece together the picture of carbon content and soil fauna and flora fluctuating over time.
Thank you.
Okay, rather than clap that you won't hear, if we have a kind of a COVID wave as a thank you, and just leaves me to say thank you so much for this evening. I think it's been a great success.